Up next, we have Gary, who is incredibly more impressive than I am. So I will leave this to you, and I'm not going to steal this and punk you.
Thank you. I just gave you a shock. I'll give you this back. Hi, everybody. Actually, I'm going to start with beer. That's probably a good place to start. My career started with a beer, actually, so that's probably a good place to start. I want to talk about beer. I want to talk about my dad. I want to talk about social networks and kind of what's social networks. I'm responsible for marketing at Facebook, but my career started actually with a beer. I was at home watching a baseball game, falling asleep on the couch, and my dad encouraged me to go to this fundraiser for this congressman who I'd worked for out of college. And this guy walked up to me, and I was getting a beer at a keg. And I struck up a conversation with him, and he said to me, what do you do? And I was trying to change jobs, going from working in government to try to get a job in marketing. And he said, I'll make you a deal if you work on my campaign. He was running for Board of Finance in our hometown. He said, if you work on my campaign, I'll get you an interview. And his best friend had a job opening as a marketing analyst at Pepsi. And two people I worked for at Pepsi ended up being early at eBay, brought me and my family moved out to California to join eBay, and then on and on and on. The reason I'm telling you that is I think exactly what you were just saying is so much of this really comes down to two things, I think. Maybe three if you add beer. Beer is actually, I think, rather important. One is the nature of people and the important part of people and how you kind of carry yourself and get connected with people through your career. A lot of that can be luck. I'll touch back on this more toward the end. And a lot of it has to do with agility. And agility, you know, there's a software term around agility about how people now, rather than in a serial way, in a kind of concurrent, iterative way, build software. But agility in terms of how you learn, how you adapt, because all of what was been said for the last set of speakers is, I couldn't agree with more. What's happening is this rate of change, the rate of disruption, will just continue to accelerate. I know you hear that a lot, but one of the things I find that's kind of practical, if you actually use the reference of the iPhone being 10 years old, nearly all the companies who are actually succeeding and winning in cell phones back then are gone. And the way I think about it, the way we certainly think about it in companies where I've worked, certainly the case with Facebook right now, is we act as if we're going to go out of business. And I think that's really important. And so as a result, this idea of kind of the nature of agility and going out of business gets me back to my dad. So my dad worked in advertising for about 30 years, mostly at the same firm. And at the age of 59, they lost their major account, and he had 2 months' notice. So 30 years, 2 months' notice. And my father was a company guy. I don't know how many people, I'm kind of going to date myself, know the book, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. But my dad, there you go, thank you for that. My dad was of that era, which was essentially, well, he's kind of the Mad Men era. I like to say he was of that era, but not that dysfunction, fortunately. And in terms of his advice to me was, this is really, the business that you're going to go into is about people. This is not about companies. This is about people. And so I think a big part of that is, his other piece of advice was to be the client, but this idea to continue to learn. Now, continuing learning, I found myself a couple of years later, about 10 years later, still at Pepsi. And one of the most famous creative directors in the history of advertising, a guy named Phil Duesenberry, who did a lot of the big Pepsi campaigns, came to come speak about the emergence and change of technology. And this is in 1995, and he said, actually, the internet he thought would be a fad. Now, you guys have just met me, you don't really know me. I'm not usually that kind of visceral of a person, but I remember being in the audience and thinking to myself, I gotta get myself out of this job. I gotta go do something else. I moved into technology about 2 years later in 97 and kind of stayed in that since. But when you actually see things that are major trends and you have this kind of sense to yourself that I've actually got to make a change, it does come down to these 2 points of who are the people around you. I think this idea of, you know, how do you actually get a beer with somebody based upon the knowledge you have is exactly right. And then what is your ability to kind of take what you know and with agility move to what's next? Now, I think the big part of what's happening is, I find it somewhat frustrating, to be honest, that this is considered relatively new. The fact of the matter is, as it relates to technology, the internet, as it relates to Amazon, in terms of Amazon, what they're doing in their strategy, and for that matter, the consumer browser, dates back to 1994. So we're essentially a generation into this. And for a lot of people, the way they're thinking about it is that this is essentially disruption. That term comes up in terms of disruption. This has been coming for quite some time. And I think the thing that I'm trying to bring to the teams I work with and what we're trying to get to is have people really understand the impact this is having on people in society and actually get us the conviction to move much more quickly. And in terms of moving much more quickly, I think there's a set of things about what we're going to try to rely on from one another as we kind of interact with people and grow as people in this nature of technology. With the disruption that has happened with our individual lives and how technology become more central to it, certainly there has been this move to mobile, and I think you've made great summaries of that, and we talked about that as it relates to retail and the changing nature of how we think about developing products inside companies. I want to talk a little bit more about what this means for the nature of people. So certainly I think one of the things that we're focused on in terms of where I work is this idea of through technology, we've got to learn how to be supportive of one another. And in terms of support of one another, one of the things that I think has been part of the internet since it started, if you go all the way back to GeoCities, maybe I'll go back to the same gentleman who knew the man in the gray flannel suit, if you remember GeoCities. GeoCities, since we've kind of started in technology and the internet, there's been this desire to find through this technology something that I think is quite interesting, which is actually very deep humanity. How can we connect with one another in ways that are meaningful? How can we actually help to understand one another in ways that deepens understanding from one another? The thing that's actually vital to some of this, I think, to recognize, because we're very fortunate to live in a place where I think it is very much like the Renaissance, where we're in this midst of technology, is how much the world isn't this. And a couple of data points to understand is kind of background. First of all, 2/3 of the world is actually not on the internet. Most of the world actually does not have a 4G connection. Most of the world is on a 2G connection. And 85% of the world is within reach of a cell phone tower. So those 2/3 of people who don't have connection, nearly all of them are within reach of a cell phone tower. And the reason they're not on the internet is usually two reasons. One is cost, simple fact of data costs, which I think we can all understand, and certainly in certain markets it's quite expensive to have a cell phone, much less cable TV. But the other part is they're not sure why they should be on it. Now, the reason I think this is really vitally important to recognize is as you're kind of interacting and building products, you're building products for the world, and the world isn't us. But I think having the empathy to understand what the world actually needs as it relates to technology starts with this fundamental understanding of what position are people in and how do we actually bring people along with us. As part of that, I think the other thing that technology is starting to be looked at to do more is to make sure that we're safer as a community. The reliability that we have for what's next door to us at times isn't what we want it to be. And you're seeing businesses like Nextdoor, certainly part of what people do with Facebook with groups, Instagram groups, et cetera, are rising because this is an opportunity for people to find safety and communality with one another as we go through this major technology shift. The other trend that's actually big as it relates to going beyond being supportive and safe is informed. And as a lot has been written about this in the last set of months, you're seeing in terms of social media, the nature of the news media, as those business models continue to evolve. Again, the disruption of this has been happening for quite some time. The peak employment in the US in journalism, in the news media, was actually in 1993. So the shrink of news media and what's going on, and the disruption that's been going on in our economy actually happened with the beginning of classified ads online, which was referenced earlier back in the early 90s. So this continues to evolve and accelerate. But the need for us and how we're going to be informed from one another, the role we're each going to play in how we inform one another, the role we actually each play in taking each other from extremes to understanding is a big trend that will continue to evolve. And I think in relation to that information, the other part is how we all become engaged. I think one of the things that's been fascinating to watch in various economies in the last year, particularly the US, is the extent to which people are starting to now feel much more engaged in the need to be civically engaged. One of the things that you're seeing happening through social media is actually connecting people more to their government officials, and the information of understanding everybody who's local to everybody who's national. Almost all those people are online, have social media in some regard, some more famously than others. But certainly as it relates to the connection that people are going to have with their individual elected representatives and how information flows between and among elected representatives and their constituents will continue to evolve. And I think the last point, which gets to this point of how we're all not yet connected in the world, is this idea of diversity, inclusiveness, and belonging. I think one of the things that I think is the hope of what's trying to be going on in social media and broadly in technology is this general sense of optimism. That as this continues to evolve, as we can kind of continue to have the role we actually play for one another through social media and through the ability to connect information to one another, that'll lead to a society that's more understanding and belonging for one another. Now, the last thing I want to say gets back to the point of people, which is I've always felt that if you actually do good work for good people, it actually works. I remember actually talking about somebody on one of our teams who was complaining time and time again about the project they were on and weren't quite satisfied with the projects they were on. And I actually said to them quite simply, if you do good work for good people, it largely takes care of itself. But a lot of that has to do with your ability and the ability over time to find yourself in positions where you can find good people to work with and hold them accountable to that. And if not, have the agility in your own career, have your agility with your own skill set to either make a move, improve the surroundings that you're in at any given time, and so you can actually continue to grow. And as it relates to the kind of role of technology, one of the things I want to kind of leave you with is I've certainly found that the more I've been investing myself and the people that are around me into really understanding deeply how does technology work, making sure I understand how the products work, I understand both the math, the science, and the art, whether it be design or the analytics. That breadth of skill set is pretty central. And as we all become more involved in technology, the importance of deepening our skill set in those areas, I think allows us the ability to thrive in the economies to come. So with that, I want to kind of move it on. Steve.